I've often been asked what it was like to grow up surrounded by famous people. It is a question that leaves me dumb. 4-year-olds haven't the faintest idea what it means to be famous or infamous. They either like someone or they don't, and judge people with uncanny clarity on their warmth, friendliness, and approachability. I have found that with allowances for circumstance and history, most people are pretty much alike, driven to greater and lesser degrees by fear, longing, ambition, and desire. As a child, this is how I viewed the adults who flowed through our house and my world, as nice or not so nice, fun or distant. My view of my father is therefore much the same, seen through my own very personal lens. Regardless of whatever pulled on his coattails when I was little, like all children, I just cared about how much attention he was paying to me. When my father died, accolades flowed, and many an erudite observer sought to delineate once and for all, if not the role he played in furthering international understanding, then at least his influence on broadcasting and reporting in the 20th century. Because that was what he was first and foremost, a reporter. It is how he described himself, often with a marked vehemence. I am not a television personality. I am a reporter, a reporter. The more refined title of journalist never sat as well with him as the simple, descriptive term of reporter. I don't comment, I don't judge, I report. This book seeks to honor what he valued most, reports filed in print and broadcast over the air about what he observed in his assigned and chosen territory, the United States of America. It begins as the Second World War ends, with the sun rising on the second half of the 20th century. It is divided chronologically into decades, each section presenting pieces from that time. In keeping with this somewhat arbitrary though useful framework, I will loosely also look back by decades to my life with my father, relating as best I can, not the events and the facts, I shall leave that to the reporter, but what was going on at home. Though I would not presume to know with certainty what Daddy was feeling or thinking, I feel comfortable in sharing my impressions. They are offered as just that, for in the end I can speak for no one else. As my reflections in this book are primarily about my life with my father, I have not addressed our broader family life. My parents each had been married before and had children from their first marriages. My mother's children are Holly and Stephen, and my father's son is John. Holly and Stephen lived with us, and John with his mother, Ruth. It may seem from the stories I tell that I was an only child. This was in some ways true, and in others decidedly not. But Holly was 11 years older than I, and Stephen and Johnny both, coincidentally, 8, a span of years that seemed enormous when we were young. Stephen went away to boarding school when I was 3 and Holly to college when I was 11, and although I couldn't wait for their return for holidays, for most of my childhood I was the only kid at home. So many of my early memories relate to stories I have been told, making it difficult to know exactly if I remember the event myself, or if it simply has been implanted time and again by others and by familiar photographs. One of the earliest memories I have of my father was of Sunday nights. In the early 1950s, his star was rising. He was a regular correspondent for the Manchester Guardian. His radio broadcast letter from America seemed pretty secure, and he was the host of a television program called Omnibus. My impression that his feet seemed rarely to touch the ground was probably correct. He was a tightly strung, lean, energetic, and engaged man at the time, whose focus, ambition, and intelligence had secured for him a stronghold in New York City. Though his commitments were certainly demanding, taking him away from home a considerable amount of the time, what I recall was that when he was home the air was charged with vitality. At no other time was this more true than on Sunday nights. Omnibus was broadcast live, and after each show a slew of the crew came to our house for dinner, always the same fare, chili, and beer. High on the excitement of the show, elated that it was over, and not yet under the weight of next week's production, they were a very merry and raucous group. My bedroom at the time was a maid's room just off the pantry. The pantry led to the dining room, and if I lay at the end of my bed, opened my door just a crack, and made sure that the door to the dining room was also open, I could watch a section of the table and feel part of the gaiety. Generally, I was in bed before the crew even arrived at the apartment, and I remember Daddy coming in to kiss me good night and ask if I had seen the show. His entrance into my dark slice of a bedroom was like a thunderbolt strike, and I would jump on the bed with excitement. Later I would drift off to sleep on the waves of laughter and camaraderie, the smell of chili, the sound of my mother bustling in and out of the kitchen. To this day, several people from Omnibus remain close friends of our family. During the 1950s, it seems to me that the initial elation my father felt at his rising good fortune began to give way a bit to the sobering reality of all he had taken on. As one of the first real television personalities, he was often asked to speak about the evolving medium. As Omnibus struggled for survival and sponsorship, his impatience with the hard reality of its financing grew. He was barraged with offers to lecture on a variety of topics, play parts in films, and write for various periodicals and magazines. He was in great demand, and there pervaded in the household an understanding that we cut him a wide berth. This was essential, since he worked in the apartment. The doors to his study remained closed from the moment he awoke until he shut up shop in the evening. We were keenly aware that what was happening within his study was none of our concern. This work routine would remain intact until he gave up Letter from America in February 2004, a week after he was diagnosed with cancer and only a month before he died at the age of 95. Though he was very busy in those days, he was also capable of putting aside his professional demands. During the summer months, he went out to our summer beach cottage on the North Fork of Long Island every weekend, and was for the most part able to leave work behind. I do, however, recall a few times when he drove up the driveway on Friday afternoon to the phone ringing from Manhattan. Some event had occurred during his 3-hour drive that rendered irrelevant his freshly recorded Letter from America, which would be broadcast over the weekend. On those occasions, he would simply go into the kitchen, pour himself a glass of milk, get in the car, and head back to the city. Before he became obsessed with golf, he fished. Fishing is an early morning endeavor, and the fact that Daddy even considered this pastime is staggering to me. Being a night owl, he went to bed around 2 a.m. and generally rarely rose before 10 a.m. I, on the other hand, am an early bird. How clearly I recall tiptoeing into my parents' bedroom and waking him on our fishing days. He would ceremoniously make us a lunch of bologna sandwiches, and we'd go off to Captain Jim's to rent a tiny boat with a 10-horsepower motor. Fishing from a small boat, afloat on the changing tide in a small bay, is all about waiting. Perhaps that is why those trips made such an impression on me. Daddy, for all his flurry, energy, verbosity, and dynamism, could sit silently at the end of a fishing pole like no one else I've ever seen. Maybe it was a relief for him not to talk. He was always shushing me, telling me the fish could hear us speaking, that we had to be quiet or they wouldn't bite. Another thing that was surprising about the fishing trips was that for a pretty squeamish person, he never flinched at baiting the hooks or handling and cleaning the fish. When I was 11, I caught an especially large kingfish, the record that season for Peconic Bay. The catch made it into the local paper, and Daddy preened and waxed eloquent about the lucky day. I was delightfully surprised at his reaction to the catch. He was as excited as I'd ever seen him. His uncensored and ready expression of emotion was as infectious as it could be unnerving. Though he had been raised in a strict Methodist household in Blackpool, his passionate nature was not subdued by that restrictive environment. When he was happy, you knew it instantly, and when he was not, well, you knew that too. In one of the prayers I wrote for his memorial service at Westminster Abbey, I called him a man of tender heart. I did not mean that he wished none of God's creatures ill, or that he was a softy in any sentimental sense. On the contrary, he often remarked that one of the great bonds he and my mother shared was that together they had not a single ounce of sentimentality. He had a tender heart because it was always exposed, as if he were so busy dashing hither and yon that he couldn't be bothered to cover it. This made him receptive to the person on the street, available, if you will, to hear a story. And when he was happy, he whistled and danced, his joy a welcome contagion that spread through our house. But he was just as easily wounded, developing, I believe, the art of ready dismissal as a result. It was not that he didn't feel the slight, the reproof, the judgment. He just learned to sweep it from his emotional desktop with alacrity and, on occasion, no small measure of reciprocal reproof. The one feeling he could not dismiss, the one emotion that flattened him, was fear. For a man of great intelligence, remarkable knowledge, and accomplishment, he was a scaredy-cat. The first time I sensed his being profoundly afraid was during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. I say this with the valued perspective that comes only with time and years of looking back. Like many who grew up in the 1960s in the United States, I was terrified of the Russians and nuclear war. But I was keenly aware that I was more frightened than my friends were, and I took it as a sign of weakness. In that tense week in October 1962, I looked to him for reassurance, asking if we were going to war. I think that actually what I asked was that he tell me we weren't going to war. "I can't tell you that," he said. I now realize that my fear was weighted by his. I have wondered over time if his grave concern might not have been the result of more information than he could have ever shared. Though he was not the Manchester Guardian's Washington, D.C. correspondent at the time, his connection with men at the front of the situation was very real. His first friend in the United States, Gene Rostow, was the brother of Walt Rostow, President Kennedy's national security advisor. Adlai Stevenson, United States Ambassador to the United Nations, was a close friend. Although during the Bay of Pigs disaster earlier that year, Stevenson had been humiliated and used by the Kennedy administration, his bequeathal and anointing as the spokesperson in October had an air of righteous vindication to it. It has recently become public knowledge that the situation in October of 1962 was every bit as dire as even our wildest nightmares could have suggested. Until he died, Daddy remained ever watchful and fearful of the trembling of the fingers on the nuclear bomb. Fearful not so much of the bombs as of the frailty of the humans who controlled them. Whenever some international fracas sparked hot and wild, he would say with an air of resignation, "This may be it." He passed to me the ability, the practiced skill of being good and scared, or at least on occasion appropriately anxious, while on other occasions inappropriately so. This is not to be confused with what is now termed an anxiety disorder. We just shared a ready fear of international calamity. Against the backdrop of the international Cold War, a certain Cold War was going on at the time in our house as well. Though I believe my parents' marriage to have been remarkably solid, all marriages experience times of stress, and theirs was no exception. During the 1950s and 1960s, they traveled a bumpy road, though they definitely traveled it together. They stayed together through difficult times because they quite simply never lost their love for one another. My mother often remarked how fortunate she felt to be married to her best friend. A painter all her life, she lived with her greatest fan, and her eye and artistic sense were never lost on my father. "One of the most important things I have learned from my wife," he would observe, "is an appreciation for dirty colors." Ever conscious of the pressure on reporters to clarify, delineate, perhaps even rush to simplicity in black and white, he took this new way of seeing as a cautionary and enriching lesson. Though Daddy could be impatient and dismissive towards her at times, after 57 years she still inspired his puppy-love adoration. During the last weeks of his life, the apartment that was normally their quiet haven was occupied, aside from me, by round-the-clock hospice and nursing care and all the mechanical support required by one who is bedridden. At 91, the management of Daddy's routine was beyond Mummy. She felt a bit superfluous as a result, and one afternoon expressed this to him. Lifting himself up on his pillows, with a clarity and strength of voice he had not had for weeks, he looked her straight in the eye and said, "Don't you understand that the only person I want in the world is you? I long to be here, just the two of us, as it's always been. But it can't be like that now. We both need more help." Throughout their marriage, regardless of ups and downs, he was always clear about his feelings for her. During the rough patch in the 50s and 60s, a symptom of their established marital diplomacy was that my mother traveled to Europe every spring by herself. Several weeks later, my father would sometimes join her, but when I was growing up, spring in the city meant bubble gum, baseball cards, roller skates, and my father's earnest forays into single parenthood. Because we had a live-in maid, it did not fall upon him to tend to my daily schedule of school, riding lessons, laundry, and meals, but he did enjoy on occasion stepping into the role of the indulgent parent. The most memorable of such times was when he took me to Kentucky the first weekend in May to stay with some friends on a lavish farm outside Louisville and go to the Derby. I was 10 at the time, horse-mad and wild about the country. But this was not just country. This was heaven. I arose at dawn and ran with woolly sheep and wobbly lambs through fields flecked with buttercups and daisies. I was taken horseback riding down lanes that smelled of magnolias and galloped over grass that really was blue. The grandeur of the estate on which we stayed was unlike anything I had ever imagined, and Daddy took great pleasure in my total happiness. In keeping with the fairy tale adventure, our seats at Churchill Down were directly over the finish line. Flying back to New York, he felt compelled to bring me back to earth, to remind me that what we had enjoyed over the weekend was not real life. My recollection is that I was not interested in his wet blanket, preferring to savor the scent of a dream come true. There were times during those intermingling Cold Wars when my worry manifested itself in insomnia. My mother would ask me what the matter was, what was troubling me. I had no neat answer. Daddy, as if knowing too well the complexity of a racing spirit, simply sat on my bed and stroked my forehead, if not easing the turmoil within, at least the furrowed brow without. He was not a man overly disposed towards expressions of affection. In this he reflected his age and upbringing, but he was deeply loving towards those to whom he had lost his heart, and that list was long. I have always felt I am pretty much the same person now that I was in 8th grade. My world view, my assessment of my own failings and capabilities has not changed or altered substantially in the intervening 50 years. Whether this was due to a genetic predisposition to early maturity, or to events that occurred from 1962 to 1963, or to both, I have no idea. But for whatever reason, my personality seems to have been cast then. On Friday afternoon, the 22nd of November, 1963, dressed in my cheerleader's uniform, I waited with the basketball team in the lobby of the Dalton School for the bus that would take us across town to the scheduled game. But instead of being ushered out in a single line to the bus's coughing plumes in the chill fall air, we were crowded into the lobby, students looking forward to a game or a party that night or a weekend overnight date with a friend or a night in front of the television, were told by a weeping teacher that President Kennedy had been shot. Dazed, a friend and I walked repeatedly around the block, trying in vain to march some sense into what had happened. In the end, everyone just dispersed, falling away from the searing news like ashes drifting into the air from a raging fire. What I recall most of my walk home from school that gray, cold November afternoon was the silence of the streets. Were there no cars, buses, or taxis? Surely people were crying, for they were staggering as though gravity were no longer a steady pull, but an erratic pulse on their bodies. But I can't remember the sound of shock and sorrow. Perhaps my head was so filled with incomprehension that nothing else could get in, and I was simply struck deaf. But not for long. If the streets were a daze of surreal incredulity, the atmosphere inside our apartment had all the focused energy the outside world lacked. On opening the front door that afternoon, I was slapped back to consciousness. The phones were ringing, the television on, the radio crackling. Smoke was pouring from Daddy's study, and he was alone in the apartment, frantically trying to get off the phone so that he could go back to the urgent work of figuring out what was going on and what to report. Jolted from the oppressive weight of shock and its accompanying sense of ineffectualness, I realized that, in fact, I might actually be able to do something after all. We had 2 televisions in our apartment, one in my father's study and another in a back room. The 3 major networks were scrambling to keep up with events, scooping one another from time to time, conjecturing, retracting, and surmising. In no time it was clear that I could monitor 2 stations in the other room and report back to the study with developments. What was tricky was figuring out what was potentially significant and consequently when it was all right to interrupt Daddy's frantic hammering at the typewriter. And still the phone never stopped ringing with demands that he file his piece, his broadcast, immediately. At one point, late in the night, when I was still in my little navy blue pleated cheerleader's skirt, and he was rumpled and wild, and we were both hungry and tired, he exclaimed to some impatient editor, "Listen, we are doing the best we can." We. And that was it for me. It was such an affirmation, such a declaration of both worth and appreciation, that there dropped from my psyche layers of cumbersome adolescent insecurity. Later, when I heard him relate to friends and colleagues his appreciation of my help over that long weekend, I flushed with delight. Was this a turning point in our relationship? I think not so much a turning point as a cementing and a cherished affirmation for me that I was not just little Susie anymore. The dawning of this altered view had begun a year or so earlier, when Daddy had expressed some admiration for some short stories I had written for a class assignment at school. He'd been so enthusiastic that he had given the stories to his friend Bennett Cerf, who was then head of Random House. Naturally, I was thrilled, but not so much at Bennett's praise as at Daddy's, since he was the real taskmaster when it came to language and words. Sometimes I think it's a miracle I even dare open my mouth, having been raised by someone who never, ever let the slightest grammatical imperfection go uncorrected. Brendan Gill, theater critic for The New Yorker, on one of the several occasions he introduced my father at a speaking engagement, dubbed him the corrector. When it came to the English language, Daddy was a fanatic, a man possessed of a passion. He loved the language, its sound and meaning, its cultural reflection and heritage. Nothing got his goat like newly created idiomatic obfuscations. The word area, as in we are now approaching the Philadelphia area, drove him crazy. We are now approaching Philadelphia, he would shout. Another, on a daily basis, evoked a classic response. My doctor asked me if I have a bowel movement on a daily basis, and I told him that I do not. I have it on the toilet. He enjoyed corresponding about language with people similarly afflicted with his passion, notably H.L. Mencken, William Safire, and Nunnally Johnson. When he became concerned that his memory might be slipping, a ridiculous worry from someone who could recall details, dates, and events like few others, he decided to put himself to sleep at night by reciting Shakespeare's plays. The English language, beautifully presented, was a balm to his soul. As is so well known and endlessly documented, the 1960s were pivotal in the United States. Changes were being effected in the structure, the thinking, and the functioning of American life, predominantly as a result of the Civil Rights Movement and the Vietnam War. Daddy suffered neither fools nor change gladly. His feelings about the Vietnam War and the protest movement it sparked stemmed, I think, in large part from his law-abiding nature, deep respect for authority, and, if not a particular president, surely the office of the presidency itself. To those who would judge administrative policy, he would proclaim, "You don't know the facts." He didn't claim that he did either, but in the absence of such, he was always willing to defer to those in authority. In light of this, the tactics employed by the more radical leaders of the anti-war movement were anathema to him. My parents' differing views about the Vietnam War would prove a constant irritant during the course of that engagement. My mother was against the war from the start, and her position only became more vehement as time went on. The simple fact that one of their inviolate traditions was to watch the news together each evening meant that they argued about the war most nights. Loosened by the twilight wine of Scotland, their tongues slashed like daggers in the small study. This time in the evening became known in our family from then on as the Jane and Alistair show. Unlike many of my contemporaries, I was not a dedicated protester of the war, though I was definitely against it. Working at a publishing house in New York, I was more engaged in the Manhattan literary scene than campus riots. My job kept me in the city in the summer of 1968, while my mother was out at our beach cottage on Long Island. As it was an election year, my father did a lot of traveling, so it was perfectly normal for him to be at the California primary in Los Angeles on the 4th of June of that year. But it was not a normal night, and when news first broke that Senator Robert Kennedy had been shot, I somehow knew that Daddy was close to it, though I would not know until later that he had actually been in the pantry. Waking early to the shattering news, I waited by the phone for him to call. He didn't call, however, until late on the afternoon of the 5th of June, by which time I was frayed, but not as frayed as he. His voice was a grave rubbing of its original. It was bumpy and unclear with jagged edges and none of its usual forthright clarity. Only in the last days of his own life would I hear that gravelled tone again. Certainly he was shattered, but he also had a job to do, and as he said, a professional is someone who can do his best work when he doesn't feel like it. So he did his job, and he came home to collapse. During the 1960s, he worked very hard at what he did best, reporting. Omnibus had ended, and he was not an especially recognizable celebrity in the United States. Therefore, I did not grow up with a famous father. I was married in 1968, and it wasn't until the early 1970s that his career in television brought him the recognition he had until he died. With the America series and then Masterpiece Theater, he became once again a celebrity. But by that time I was married, living in Vermont and raising a family. Although my father never mentioned it, my getting married at the age of 19 was difficult for him. Late in December of 1968, the wedding ceremony was to take place at 5 p.m., and at 3:30 he was still in bed. I kept asking my mother what was the matter with him, and she replied, "His little girl is getting married." Finally, at close to 4 p.m., she and I went into their bedroom, and with great command and authority, she said, "Alistair, your daughter is getting married in an hour, and you have to get up now." 9 years later, when that marriage ended in divorce, he was, as my mother said, like a canary let out of a cage. It wasn't that he hadn't liked my first husband. He just preferred my undivided attention and was shameless in his delight at thinking he'd have it again. When shortly after my divorce we went to England to spend Christmas with my sister, I recall his saying to my mother one night as we drove across London in a cab, "Hey, sweetie, isn't this great? We've got Susie back." Which, of course, was not the case, as I had 2 small boys and a busy life in Vermont. In a couple of years, my second husband, Charlie, and I were married, and my father came to accept and even delight in the increasingly full life I was living in the wilds of Vermont. During the 1970s, for the first time, Daddy started to make more money than he needed for his and my mother's normal living expenses. His feelings about money, however, were deeply entwined with his strict Methodist upbringing. My grandfather had been a Methodist lay preacher, and though not the powerhouse in the family, my grandmother amply filled that role. He instilled in my father the iron rod of ethical behavior, based first and foremost on Scripture. Hence, interest was usury, to get something for nothing immoral. The fact that he kept his money in a checking account was not only a result of his financial naivete, it was intentional as well. He also believed that money was the root of all evil. When first America and then Masterpiece Theater started looking as though they might make him some money, he retreated into a minor depression. My mother observed that he was far more frightened of having money than not having it. And this is where we came to blows about the war. Exasperated, idealistic, and strident, I accused him of funding the bombing of Cambodia by donating the interest his money generated to the federal government's war chest. He was cursory and sharp in his dismissal of my stupidity, and I didn't bring it up again, knowing a blind spot when I saw one. Religion in our house was pretty much a taboo subject. In order to know why, it is helpful to understand both my parents' religious upbringings. As mentioned, my father grew up in Blackpool in a deeply faithful culture. Methodism in the early part of the 20th century in northern England was about as strict as any religious teaching could be. When Daddy received a scholarship to Cambridge University, he essentially left God before God could leave him. And leave him he was sure God would, for 3 specific reasons. First, he had a cowlick in his hair that required a liberal application of hair tonic to control. Surely God would punish him for such a display of vanity. Second, He was crazy about music, especially American jazz. He suspected God would look harshly on such frivolity and judge him accordingly. Third, he thought girls terrific. Surely he would be sent to the fires of hell for what he longed to do. Part of his leaving Blackpool and his upbringing was to cast aside the restraints of the church. My mother's experience was similar. She grew up in Montclair, New Jersey, and was raised an Episcopalian. Like my father's, her view of God was of a harsh and judgmental deity. She told of playing hide and seek as a child one day, and of finding herself neatly hidden away beneath a bed chewing on some gum that had lost its flavor. She stuck the gum to the bed slats over her head. But no sooner had she done so than she knew God was watching, so she peeled the gum from the board, taking layers of varnish with it, and placed it back in her mouth. When she was 15, she went to the rector of her church to ask him a nagging question. "The bread and the wine," she said, "are they symbols, or do they really turn into flesh and blood?" "They really turn into flesh and blood," the rector replied. "They don't taste like that to me," she said, and was gone for good. Coming together from different, though surprisingly similar theological backgrounds, my parents vowed that they would never inflict upon their children the oppressive, repressive religious upbringings they had endured. Whether it is simply indicative that all parents are doomed to failure, or that the forbidden fruit always has the sweetest aroma, in 1987, at the age of 38, I decided that I wanted to go into the ministry. Having worked in publishing directly after high school, I had not received a bachelor's degree, and quickly and sinkingly realized that I would have to go to college before seminary. I told my parents only that I wanted to go to college after all, not daring to mention my real intention. Only 2 years later, as I was approaching my final year and applications to graduate school, did I muster the courage to tell them my plan. I anticipated that they might well be the only parents in America who, upon hearing of their child's intention to enter the ministry, would hang their heads and wonder what they had done wrong. But they surprised me. My mother was admittedly baffled, but very supportive. As an ardent pragmatist and believer in science, her refrain would always be, "But how can you believe in God and in science?" Her curiosity was real, and she was intrigued to have a member of the enemy camp in her midst. My father's reaction was first shock that gave way to a growing sense of intrigue and perhaps even pride. Oddly enough, I think he subconsciously felt there might be hope for him yet, that my affiliation might stand him in good stead at the pearly gates. It took 10 years for me to complete my training for the ministry, and during that time my father talked more openly about his own beliefs and musing. When he was around 80, he said to me, "A day does not go by that I do not recall a piece of scripture that I learned by rote at the age of 8, and more I see that it is the foundation of who I am." I have wondered if his late reconsideration of religion still carried with it the weight of judgment, and if this might not have contributed to the turmoil he experienced upon turning 80. Though he was in good health, he was increasingly frail, and his life was changing. The schedule of Masterpiece Theater, his speaking engagements, preparing books for publication, and his ever-beloved letter all put a great deal of pressure on him. As a result, he was often grumpy and crotchety. In 1988, he and my mother came to Vermont for Thanksgiving. He was always a little uneasy about visiting Vermont. He had a deep angst about going into the wilderness, as he called it, going to the land I had chosen as home. He was a city person at heart, and too much green, unless it was on a golf course, made him nervous. A house plant was often enough to bring on an anxiety attack. Until he settled in, he was a little on edge in the country. But on this particular trip, he never did settle down. It seemed to me that we could do nothing right. I didn't remember his saying one nice thing all weekend. The kids were too boisterous, the cake wasn't sweet enough, the turkey dry, the house cold, the dog too affectionate, the TV reception pathetic, the roads icy, and on and on. He and my mother flew back to New York City on Saturday, and I brooded for a day. I felt that I had lost him, that he was dead to me, that there was no sense in his coming again if he was going to be so disagreeable. Right at the start of Advent, I was in a foul place, a wilderness. I was cross and hurt and sad. Had it not been Advent, I might not have heard the call to hope, the call to courage and honesty, the small voice crying in the wilderness. So on Sunday afternoon I called my mother, I have only so much courage, and told her through my tears how I was feeling. Early on Monday morning, around 7, she called back. She said that she'd told him what I had said and that he'd been completely shocked. He had no idea he'd been behaving that way, no idea he had hurt the most important people in his life. Mother said that he had wanted to call on Sunday night, but was crying so hard that he couldn't. She said he hadn't slept much and would probably be calling soon. Around 9 o'clock the phone rang. It was Daddy. He said that he was very sorry, that he had had a lovely time, and that the last thing in the world he wanted to do was to hurt us. "Please believe me," he said, his voice cracking. I told him the truth. I told him that I did believe him. What I didn't do was to brush it off as I might normally have done by saying, "It's okay, it's nothing." It was something. But what was more was what was happening right then. I told him, I think, that I loved him and that I didn't want to lose him, and I knew in that moment I wouldn't. My father was not an egotist, one inclined to exaggerate one's self-worth, but he was by nature egocentric, wrapped up in himself. Compounding his natural inclination, he had a lot going on and a great deal of attention and admiration flowing his way. So my mother and I took it upon ourselves to shake him down every once in a while and bring him back to reality. These radical wake-up calls were never easy. They involved tears and trauma and rants of varying degrees, but they always cleared the air and brought him back to us. Aside from the intense calls to attention, I must admit that my mother and I, and my sister to a lesser degree, did see it as our job to make sure that he didn't get too swelled ahead. To this end, we were, in hindsight, perhaps a bit ruthless in our kidding, but he took it in good humor, throwing up his hands and complaining, "I get no respect." A frequent source of jibing followed his having been voted in the 1970s one of the 10 best-dressed men in America. Though he cut a dapper figure and managed to portray a certain elegance, his clothes themselves were more threadbare than anyone would imagine. He didn't have time to fuss over his attire most of the time, but his magnetic personality commanded attention, making him appear well turned out and dashing. As he aged, his rumpled appearance was a result, I'm certain, of elderly, failing eyesight. He simply didn't see the spills of Ovaltine that decorated his clothes. My husband Charlie often called us brutal in our teasing of my father. I wonder if this happens in other families where one member is the recipient of a certain amount of public acclaim or admiration. It is almost as though, in an effort to hold on to one whom the fans would happily eat alive, the family has to recast the individual as less tasty than might be presumed. The teasing was all in good fun, and he was surprisingly tolerant of our barbs. His sense of humor, his delight in good jokes, or stories, as he called them, was with him until the last difficult weeks of his life. He applied the same intensity to enjoyment as he did to work, cultivating laughter the way others dote over African violets. Certain friends were great sources of stories, and as soon as he heard a good one, he'd call me. "I've got one for you," he'd say. Though he loved a good story, what enthralled him more were the real-life turns of fortune or phrase that surprised and shocked. One of his favorites actually happened to him. As he told it, he had, by necessity, developed a quick response to people who approached him saying, "I know who you are," or "Are you who I think you are?" Flippantly, he would simply say, "Yes, I'm Bob Hope," and smiling continue on his way. One afternoon, while staying at the Huntington in San Francisco, Daddy was headed out of the hotel. Going down the steps from the main entrance, he came upon an elderly woman ascending the same stone stairs. She stopped, looked at him, and said, "Are you who I think you are?" "Yes," he replied, "I'm Bob Hope." To which she replied, "Isn't that interesting? I'm Mrs. Bob Hope." "And she was," Daddy exclaimed as he fell over laughing. The joke was on him, and far from being embarrassed or shy about it, he loved it. His love of a good laugh balanced, I think, the very serious daily dose of hard reality he was forced to swallow in his job as a reporter. His weekly letter had much the same effect, allowing, as it did, a look not at the headlines of the news, but rather at the people and context, their lives and idiosyncrasies. As he grew older, he became naturally less resilient, suffering as he did from arthritis and a gut with a proclivity to inflammation. The total knee replacement he received when he was days shy of his 84th birthday gave him a new lease on life, but his heart was increasingly troublesome, requiring a pacemaker and careful monitoring. The decline in health that he experienced in the last 5 years of his life was, I believe, exacerbated by the events of the 11th of September, 2001. Fueling his lifelong fear of nuclear war or some sort of major world calamity, it was as though his nightmare had come true, and he would remain haunted by it for the rest of his life. Since my mother was on Long Island, Daddy was alone in the apartment that Tuesday morning in September. I tried calling him as soon as the news came of the planes crashing into the Twin Towers, but neither my mother nor I could reach him as the phone lines were down in the city. We both worried that he had heard the news and collapsed of a heart attack. It wasn't until the next day that we heard from my cousin in England, who for some reason had been able to get through to him, that he was fine and doing what the situation required, reporting. Far from paralyzing him by anxiety, the crisis summoned in him a strength and determination recently dimmed by infirmity. Once again he was the observer, out looking for the human interest stories as well as the big news. Though he was still able at the age of 92 to go around the block for a quart of milk, he rarely did so despite my mother's urging that he stir his stumps. That week in September, he was padding the streets more than he had been in the previous 6 months. "I went looking for milk," he said. "There's no milk in this city, only a warm, chalky white liquid called dairy creamer that makes your cereal taste foul." He told of going out to dinner at the local restaurant because, unlike his own icebox, theirs still had food. "It's not like New York," he said. "It's a small town now. People don't sit at their table and mind their own business. Everyone talks together because everyone's business is the same." In a matter of days, though, as the practical aspects of procuring food and drink eased and supplies once again were trucked into the city, his apprehension about the future grew and would remain a cloud over his head for the rest of his days. He continued to visit us in Vermont for Christmas until a couple of years before he died, when all travel became impossible for him. He enjoyed reading Scripture at the Christmas Eve service at the church I serve, the old meeting house, and delighted in the family traditions of food, music, and revelry. I like to think that my ministry allowed him to revisit and in some way perhaps reconcile his feelings about, if not religion, God. I will never forget a frightening night in Manhattan in the fall of 2003, when one of our daughters then attending college in the city was gravely ill and was rushed to the hospital. I was at my parents' apartment at the time, and when the call came telling me of the crisis, shaking and undone, I grabbed my coat to leave. But Daddy held my shoulders firmly in his frail, arthritic hands, looked me fiercely in the eye, and said with a command and intensity, "You must trust in the Lord." And I cried harder, not only for his acknowledgment of the severity of the situation, but that he could say it out loud, though exactly what it said of his own faith I am not certain. An especially nice offshoot of my ministry was his meeting Frederick Buechner, a renowned writer and theologian, at my ordination where they both spoke. A friendship was immediately ignited, based thoroughly on mutual admiration. If my path had opened the door to Daddy's reconsideration of his own beliefs, Frederick Buechner blew the Spirit into his heart. Always on his bedside table would be a dictionary, whatever 3 books he was reading at the time, and a couple of Buechner's theological gems, Wishful Thinking and Whistling in the Dark. Daddy's insistence on referring to him as Dr. Buechner, though I repeatedly told him that Fred was not a Ph.D., reflected only, I think, his feeling that Buechner had healed something in his heart. It had long been my feeling that my father would either die because he stopped doing his letter or stop doing the letter because he died. As it turned out, both were in part true. In the last few years of his life, researching, writing, and recording Letter from America became his raison d'être. His weekly rhythm and moods were driven by his preparation and completion of the task. Should I have something important to discuss with him, I would never call on Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday. His intention was to record on Thursday, but more often than not, it was postponed until Friday. Wondering about his availability, I would call my mother and ask if the letter were done, and only upon assurance that it was would I call. I confess that I, too, am affected by an inclination to become preoccupied with the immediate deadline before me. Often we would speak at the end of a particular week. He would gloat that he had finished his talk and wonder if I'd done mine. Inevitably, since my sermon would not be delivered until Sunday, it was not completed, and I would kid him, lamenting that he could not operate a fax machine and send me his piece to use. In February 2004, when he was diagnosed with lung cancer that had already metastasized to his bones, he knew immediately that he would stop the letter. He experienced in those first weeks after the fateful news an odd exhilaration of sorts. As one who had certainly enjoyed a fair measure of success in his life, there was one area in which he had failed. Though a lifelong hypochondriac, he had never been gravely ill. There was a certain satisfaction, morbid to be sure, in finally having a severe diagnosis. On top of that, when his retirement was announced, the tributes and accolades poured in. It was as though he were attending his own laudatory funeral. But the thing that lifted his spirits the most was not having to pay attention to the news. He would say, "It's great. I don't have to worry about Iraq or what the Security Council is doing or not doing." Not only was he freed from having to worry about the world, he no longer had to make sense of it. Originally told that he had between 3 and 6 months to live, it turned out that his demise was far more swift. I overheard my mother speaking on the phone shortly after he died. They gave him 3 months, and he only used 1. Ever frugal by nature and upbringing, this seemed to her an honorable course to have taken. Though swift, his dying was rough. He reacted adversely to the medications given him and essentially lost 2 of his last 4 weeks to drug-induced confusion, nausea, and misery. My routine those last weeks was to spend most of the weekdays in Manhattan and then fly home to Vermont for services on the weekend, returning Sunday night. Every time I left him, I feared that I would not see him again, and the partings were wrenching for us both. Though it was a grueling time, there were moments of grace as well. Listening in the kitchen via the baby monitor, I heard my parents, then aged 95 and 91, working together on the New York Times crossword puzzle as he lay on his deathbed. The hospice nurse observed with amazement that this was not standard entertainment in such circumstances. As they die, many people look back over their lives, recalling and then releasing memories, people, and events. This was to prove a daunting task for my father. Because he was endowed with an astonishing memory, and because world history was his fascination, he had a lot to remember and let go. My husband Charlie called one morning from Vermont to ask how he was and where he was on his travel through time. "The Boer Wars," I replied. "We have a long way to go." In the end, however, it wasn't that long at all. He was able to rally in the last week a few times, once to see his dear friend Bill Buckley, another to meet with his literary executor, and a third time simply to leave his bedroom and try to regain normalcy by going into his study to watch the evening news. The last was especially moving because when my mother walked into the study, as she had for 55 years, Daddy lit up and said, "Look who's here! Hi, Tootsie!" Sadly, just 10 minutes later, he would feel too ill and return to his bedroom. In his will, Daddy asked that if possible his ashes be scattered in Central Park. In a discreet, quiet ceremony, 10 members of my family, my brother John and my father's secretary, Patty Yassick, gathered around a patch of grass as my mother watched from her window in the apartment. John sang a haunting Appalachian gospel song. I recited a psalm. We prayed and set him to rest in the park he so loved. It seemed a fitting and appropriate end. The subsequent service the following October at Westminster Abbey was as spectacular as the sprinkling of his ashes was simple, 2 appropriate reflections of a man both ordinary and extraordinary. As it turned out, however, what we thought had been an end was unfortunately the beginning of another chapter in a long life. 18 months after his death, I was informed that the night he died, his body had been stolen and his bones illegally sold. I have been asked what I think he would have made of this turn of events, of the ghastly ring of modern-day grave robbers that was uncovered. Undoubtedly, he would have appreciated the Dickensian nature of the crime and the complicated cultural forces that allowed it to happen. He would probably have researched the scandal and done a talk on it. But he would have been horrified to think that such a thing might happen to him. The subject of willed body donation was not foreign to our family, as my mother had long since made the decision to donate hers. Daddy did not like the idea and chose instead to be cremated. The discovery of this travesty was understandably difficult, as it temporarily unraveled the healing process of grief that comes, one hopes, after any death. Suddenly, I was thrown back to that dark midnight in 2004, to a dead body and not to a life I fondly remembered. Time has dimmed the impact of the situation, though its resurfacing in the news has proved a jolting reminder time and again. Nothing has been more restorative, however, than the writing of this simple introduction, and the chance to think about his life and not his death, to remember that he could whistle and hum 2 parts of a tune simultaneously, the sight of his making banana splits for his grandchildren and eating 2 himself, his adoration of my mother, His asking me at the age of 80 why my dog wagged her tail when he walked into the room, to which I replied, "Daddy, don't tell me that at the age of 80 you still don't know why dogs wag their tails." He was either pulling my leg or had been honestly otherwise engaged for some time. This book shows exactly how engaged he was with the major events of the United States in the latter part of the 20th century. It is the witness of a great writer with a keen eye, extraordinary memory, seasoned perspective, and tender heart.
1946 to 1959.
My father's affinity for interviewing ordinary people on the street was fed by his assignment in 1942 to 1943 to crisscross the United States to find out how the war was affecting its citizens. This journey, the record of which was later published as the American Home Front in the United States and as Alistair Cooke's American Journey in the United Kingdom, connected him with shopkeepers and farmers and mechanics and waitresses in a way that would never be broken. Those car and rail rides across the continent subtly and permanently shaped his particular kind of reporting. He would forever after be interested not in the flashy headline, but in what generated it, how it came to be, and how some grand event played out in the kitchens and barnyards of America and in the consciences of its leaders. I think that an especially formative experience for my father was his dogged reporting of the Alger Hiss trial between 1948 and 1950. In the book that followed, A Generation on Trial, one clearly sees his expertise as an objective reporter, his willingness to put aside any preconceived notion of whether Hiss was guilty of perjury or not, to become, in effect, a member of the jury, hearing first this side and then the other. This was a landmark in his reportorial style, his avid aversion to rush to judgment, and he received both acclaim and attack for it. What he sensed throughout the Hiss trial was a growing witch hunt in the country. Clearly this was borne out during the McCarthy era, as an anti-communist fever swept the United States and Klaus Fuchs was sentenced in England for selling nuclear intelligence to the Russians. Daddy's lifelong fear of nuclear war was entrenched in these years, as was his skepticism of any stance overly dogmatic or strident. On occasion he was criticized for not taking seriously enough the racial unrest in the 1950s and 60s. I think whatever reluctance he exhibited to joining the righteous indignation of Northern liberals was born not of denial, but of honest incomprehension. He had such a fundamental belief in the equality of all people that he could not fully comprehend racial prejudice. Perhaps it was his love of American jazz that made him feel bound in soul and rhythm to the spirit and heart of blacks in this country. His aversion to violence contributed to his dismay over the simmering unrest in the South. As the pieces in this book are printed using terms that were specific to the period in history, we have retained them as written. Hence, we have not changed the designation of Negro for the now more acceptable term Black or African American. His gift for getting beneath the surface of a story, for revealing its underpinnings and nuances, was both a blessing and a curse. It made him an excellent reporter, but it took its toll on his spirit. He felt genuine unease and apprehension about the state of the world a lot of the time. His saving grace was his ability to have a good time, to find relief in writing about light subjects, and in playing with his friends and family.
Coming Home. Letter number 1, 24 March, 1946. I want to tell you what it's like to come back to the United States after a sobering month or more in Britain, and what daily life here feels and looks like in comparison. I came back with a couple of thousand GI brides. The first shock came shortly after the liner thundered its great horn as we slipped away from the dock at Southampton. All the mothers clung to the rail, and all the babies clung to their mothers and watched England slide away. Along the entire main deck of the ship, the handkerchiefs fluttered in an unbroken line, like washing day in Manchester or Leeds. And then a small Coast Guard cutter came scuttering alongside the liner like a playful puppy. An American soldier stood at the cutter's bow, cupped his hands and yelled, "You don't want to go back, do you?" And the young mothers and wives, weeping like mad, yelled, "No!" The ship turned about, we headed into the channel, night began to fall, and we moved below deck. And then came the first surprise. There was a meal, with meat and a vegetable that was not easy to recognize right away. It was not, you see, Brussels sprouts. It was lima beans and corn. I say it because in combination they constitute a favorite American vegetable known as succotash, and the British brides had their first practical encounter with an American Indian word. Succotash means the grains are whole. Well, the grains were whole, the corn was green, the butter was fresh and plentiful, and the oranges were to take away. This went on for 5 days, though few ironies of peace are so delicate as the sight of a GI bride on the very rolling waves refusing to touch butter, plum pudding, French beans, or even a steak and kidney pie, for reasons too agonizing to go into. In other words, there were days on the ocean waves when many of them regarded the whole food problem as very academic. The 5th day out we sighted land, way off on our left. Away ahead, there, rising like a rim of mist, was the almost dewy coast of New Jersey. On the right was the flat, twinkling line of the south shore of Long Island. And then, for a half-day, with the blue sky swooping all over us, we came slowly up New York Harbor. And then we saw the towering cluster of the downtown skyscrapers, crowned with a small cloud of smoke and mist. Somebody asked why this should be so, when all around was sparkling sun and blue sky, which recalled that New York is, in one minor way, a war casualty. Before the war, there was a soft coal law in New York City that forbid any office building or factory to burn soft coal, or let's just say smoky coal, for more than 10 minutes a day. Before that, it was banned altogether. But in 1940, when war factories were cooking on sites in the boroughs of New York, the law was suspended, and it has not been put back yet. Well, scores of little freighters and tugs would pipe out 3 toots as we went by, and each time the Queen Mary would terrify the children by roaring back 3 thunderous blasts. A specially chartered ferry boat tagged along by the Mary's side, playing jazzed-up versions of "Why Did I Kiss That Girl?" and "Here Comes the Bride," and the captains of tugboats would look up and wave at the brides. And soon we saw great signs painted on the ends of docks and on the roofs of pier buildings that said, "Welcome home," and "Well done." A soldier friend of mine told me about the lump that came in his throat when he heard the bands and saw these signs. Full of pride and bounce, he came down the gangplank to meet New York and its grateful citizens. And then he started to look for a hotel room. Then just a room. He wound up begging a man who ran a Turkish bath to rig up a cot for him just for the night. That was the due of fame. That was his welcome home. And that's a normal thing to happen to you these days. My own disillusionment started the moment I was off the ship. I made a telephone call and noticed how much more tinny and battered our telephones were than those in Britain, though I should add that the New York ones work like a charm. That is to say, like an American telephone. The taxicab I rode in had one door tied on with string. The other door stayed in a droopy sort of balance, somewhere between the door frame and the running board. That night I was in another cab. The driver couldn't use his first gear, which had given up shortly before VE Day, and he couldn't go in third, which had been out of condition since the Battle of the Bulge. He also couldn't go in reverse. If he went too far past the address you wanted, he had to go right round the block again to land just right. This is a useful money-making device that I offer without patent. And I thought back to the London cabs, those solid, almost luxurious blue boxes that turn in small alleys like trick bicycle riders do on one wheel. The next morning I went to my office. At intervals of possibly 6 or 8 blocks, buildings that I knew quite well only 6 weeks before were now in powdered ruins, or in their place was an empty lot boarded up at the corner. It was very much like London, except that cranes and concrete mixers were busy in some of them, building the skeletons of new shops and office buildings that would be up by next autumn. Outside the building that contains my office, along with those for about 30,000 others, was a long queue about 80 yards long, mostly of women, but there was a sprinkling of men reading newspapers and shifting wearily from foot to foot. It was a queue for nylon stockings. At several places the queue had to be broken and patrolled by policemen to allow workers to have a smooth right-of-way into the building. I have seen this queue, sometimes 100 yards long, every day since, and yesterday I saw 2 others in Midtown New York. Now, here is a situation that is quite typical of what happens when it is announced in this country that you'll soon be able to get all you want of something that you want very much. Before nylons could be legitimately released, they could be bought at exorbitant prices in the black market. Then the big stores sent letters to all their customers with charge accounts, and in America mostly good-class housewives have charge accounts at lots of stores, even the ones they never use. This may be a convenience for when you're passing by sometime. These letters gave you a certificate, asking you to appear on a certain day to pick up a pair or 2 of nylons that they would save for you. When the day came, the ladies discovered that the stockings were not fully fashioned, and the American housewife, in disgust, would not claim her pair, deciding to wait a month or 2 till the genuine article was available. Now, this time, there are in theory enough nylons to provide most women with a single pair. But at this point starts what might be called Operation Greed. People get so afraid they'll miss their pair that they queue up for one pair and get their husbands to queue up for another. There are also standing in these queues very smooth-looking gentlemen and swarthy-looking youths in leather jackets, probably with faked certificates, who have no personal use for nylons and no wife to be a hero for. They are doing the rounds of the queues and running their own modest black market on the side. Now, nylons are not a unique case by any means. Since I got back, I have only once had butter offered me in a restaurant. The other times it has been marmalade or nothing at all. I was irritated to recall that in Britain, with your strict controls, there was not much butter, but at least everybody got his little share. Here again, a wholesaler in the black market hears that there's going to be a natural shortage of butter in the New York area, or the Chicago area, or wherever. Not a serious shortage. New York, for instance, is still trying to catch up on supplies that didn't come in when there was a tugboat strike last month. And remember that New York, Manhattan, is an island, and most of its food must come in by ferry, cross river. Now this is the insidious thing that happens. There is a natural, brief shortage, maybe only for a day or 2. The black market cannot depend these days on long shortages, so it has to make hay while the sun shines, so it corners the market and forces along the shortage, and knows there are plenty of people who will pay a little extra to get some butter. Mind you, I think it's very important to point out that 90% of the people who deal with the black market, people like my friends, are unaware of that fact. They just notice when they get home that butter costs 2 cents more this week than last. The big hotels and fancy restaurants, many of them, simply will not go for 2 days without butter. They are busy laying the foundations for their prosperous peacetime patronage, so they lay in extra supplies. And in the end, in a week or 2 weeks, almost everybody is the loser. 2 weeks ago, a strike of dairy distributors was the last straw. Last week you could roam the stores of Manhattan and not find any butter to buy. And now we've been told we shall soon be eating grey bread. The fact that what you call black bread, what we call grey, is far more nutritious and also tastes better has not been well enough publicized. You know what I'm talking about, bread with more of the wheat kernel. But in this country, the mere fact that somebody puts his finger beside his nose and says, "You're not going to have much more white bread," doesn't cause, as you might expect, loud and prolonged cheering. For I should tell you now that the ordinary store bread in America looks like dehydrated snow and tastes like blown-up blind paper. This announcement causes a panic among housewives, who fear they're going to go short of something vital. So they've been rushing around buying up stacks of white flour. This, of course, produces an even worse shortage of flour, and will lead to further reductions of grain to the farmer for his feed and to the brewers for their beer. The artificial panic is based on chronic fear. The constant absurdity, in a land of plenty, of fearing that you may go short and become like Europe. The result of this fear was that, during the war, Americans ate more meat than ever before in their history. All because they were chronically afraid they might be forced to eat less. And now, because several 100,000 housewives make a rush for the white flour they should have been glad to let go of, it's still the farmer who will have to make up for this sudden drain on the market. And add to this the fact that the new wheat extraction process leaves less what they call mule feed. That's the residue from milling that farmers feed their cows and chickens. And this will mean, in another month, or maybe less, fewer chickens, perhaps a big and unnecessary egg shortage, and a beer shortage, the likes of which the United States has not seen since Prohibition. So, when you're inclined to grumble at your drastic ration controls, think on these things, as the prophet says, and consider how hectic and unpredictable it is to be a housewife in a country where the government does not buy food in the first place, and where controls start mainly with the rather bewildered retailer. I thought you'd like to know how it feels to get back to the land of the free and the home of the brave. The G.I. Bill, Letter Number 30, 6 October 1946. You may have seen that a famous American university has recently been celebrating the 200th anniversary of its founding. Princeton is in New Jersey, which is not one of the 6 New England states. But I say that because it is unique in being, as are many towns in New England and a few in Virginia, a lovely relic of colonial America, and a complete image of a way of life that declined at the turn of the century and died after a few decades of the 19th. Princeton inevitably recalls New England, because it is a small country town where you can walk along many long streets whose houses are all variations on the exquisite colonial style, graceful wooden monuments in white, to the exciting period of American domestic architecture, known here as the Greek Revival. In this place a great university was born, and here today, in a small colonial house, lives the wise old man who, on a fateful day, sat down and wrote a letter to Franklin Roosevelt, assuring him that an atomic bomb was more than a possibility, and urging him to do something about it, because the word was confirmed that the Germans had already started. His name is Albert Einstein. If we owe a dreadful debt to Einstein, there are many other men around to whom we owe something too. I mean men around Princeton. Some ex-servicemen especially may already have wondered who lives in those other beautiful and simple houses that Americans built at a time that was like ours in being full of national pride, but unlike ours in being proud and graceful at the same time. I'm afraid the answer to that question is not ex-servicemen. If there are any, they are freaks. If you were at Princeton during these anniversary celebrations, I don't think you could help noticing any vigorous and handsome young men around, more anxious-looking than any Princeton students for a quarter-century. To their wives, they are unappreciated heroes, and to politicians, they are the headache that begins at home. They are the vets, the ex-GIs. This fall, there will be 2,080,000 young men and women applying to enroll in American universities and colleges. Just short of 1 million of them are ex-servicemen and women. At most of the big universities, and especially at the Catholic universities, between 3/4 and 4/5 of all the freshmen will be ex-servicemen, veterans as we call them. Of the whole 970,000 veterans who applied for college, 480,000 of them will be turned away. Not much short of 50% of the veterans will not get in, for the simple reason there isn't room for them. Room in a university, of course, means staff and equipment and classrooms and instruction. But to a veteran hoping to go to college, it merely turns the knife in the wound he got when he first came home. For room also means a place to put your head, a place to make a home. And of all the failures of the period we call by the grand name of post-war reconversion, the most miserable, and possibly the most ominous, is the failure to meet even the modest goals of the Federal Housing Administration that were set in the first year of peace. The National Housing Plan, made in Washington, figured it this way. To prevent an alarming drift into slumdom, between 12 and 16 million new houses have to be built in the next 10 years, which is twice as many houses every year as America has ever put up. Why twice as many? Well, we are beginning to reap the crummy harvest of our stupidity after the last war, when the price of a new home was also so inflated that many people, in buying a home they could barely afford, bought a home much smaller and jerry-built than they would have had in what we call normal times. These houses, millions of them that went up, were small and fairly fragile and cheap. When the boom came, many owners got out of them into something more pretentious. When the slump came, their rents went down like a lift. Poorer people took over. The houses went unpainted. I should point out that most houses in America, great and small, are wooden and unmended. They were already slums. Well, of the proposed 12 million new houses, the government reckoned to build 1.2 million by the end of 1946. To date, 290,000 are finished, less than a quarter. The government also reckoned to put up 200,000 shelter homes, like the pathetic wartime makeshifts called Nissen huts in Britain, done over for uncomplaining civilians, we hope. 25,000 have been finished, or 1/8. We now face the appalling fact that of the 8 million men demobilized since VJ Day, 4 million of them are having to live with relatives or friends. Do you wonder, then, that of the 500,000 who will get into college, many of them are working, under conditions unlike those of any student's life that America has ever known? Many of them are married and have children. And I'd better catch up quickly with that wrinkle in your brow and explain how they can think of going to college at all. The GI Bill of Rights is the answer. It was passed by Congress and signed by President Roosevelt in July 1944. It made some flat promises to veterans for their return to civilian life. It stipulated their unemployment allowance, pensions, their disability allowances and the like, their right to the job they left behind, and set up a scale of government loans to help them build houses, buy farms, or set themselves up in their old or new businesses. But the best reward it offered for a fighting man's life was the silver spoon, as it looked then, of a university education. The veteran was to have free tuition and $50 a month, the equal of £12.10 to live on. But this turned out to be merely the fruitiest of the Bill of Rights promises that turned sour on its exposure to civilian life. There was an ambitious rush for enrollment, a pause to wink in the mind's eye at the high-paid job the sprightly college veteran would land at graduation. Most of them, you might notice, spurned what are called liberal arts courses and went after the background of a profitable technical or scientific or business career. And then the freshman, alias veteran, turned up in the college town, alone or with a wife and child. He looked his $50 a month in the face, and it laughed right back at him. If he could find an apartment or a house or a room and kitchenette, he would think of himself as blessed. But, alas, few towns anywhere make special rents for veterans, and his $50 would be gone right away. The civilian society that he moved into, and there was the rub, didn't make way for him or do itself over. It was a civilian society, lush, heedless, and slightly money-drunk, which was what he had to fit into. This society would expect him to live by its standards and its prices. He has watched in despair while prices rose, food vanished from the shelves, and the Office of Price Administration continued its brave but rather squinting prosecution of retailers. Nothing radical like controlling distribution, just going after grocers and butchers, like giving an aspirin to keep down the fever of a man with tuberculosis. So, today, a Pennsylvania college is housing some of its students in an orphanage. At Kansas State College, 20 are in a gymnasium, 64 in a stadium, 50 in an old church, and 70 in an art museum. In Alabama, 186 men are in 90 tugboat cabins. At the University of Virginia, 700 of them are in a hospital. In Illinois, a skating rink. At Yale, a boathouse, and at Princeton, with its tradition of what the ads call gracious living, the Rhineland and Okinawa defenders of the faith will live in trailers, gymnasiums, garages, and stables. There is perhaps little solace for the self-righteousness of civilians in the fact that these men will take it better than most of us. For in spite of the grisly prospect we were warned against, of a returning army of cynics, emotional misfits, and trained killers, the Veterans Administration has found from a national survey that 8 out of 10 of them have found jobs, that on the whole they work more sympathetically with their fellows than civilians, that their instability was a false alarm, and that as college students they get better marks. If, however, half of those with ambition can't get into college, and more than half of all veterans are living like paupers, it must mean that 4 million potentially better-than-average citizens are being tantalized into revolt. For there's no denying the cynical appearance, in the cold light of peace, of the much-beloved GI Bill of Rights. I have mentioned the guarantee of a college education. If you can keep several bodies and bones together on the equivalent of £3 a week, in this land of black-market milk and inflated honey. The bill also guaranteed loans up to $2,000 at 4% interest for a house or farm or business. and droves of veterans turned up at banks their first day out of uniform asking, "Where's my 2,000?" Well, for the first 2 million veterans, there were just over 10,000 loans granted, practically all of them safe loans for homes. In some cities, as many as half the loans were refused because, by the government's own guarantee, the veteran was a poor risk in a time of inflation. These 4 million men who were led to expect too much and wound up sharing a trailer with 2 other families or falling over disgruntled in-laws are getting restless. In the last Great Depression, there was a Veterans' March on Washington, and the present General Douglas MacArthur found himself, as Chief of Staff, in the ugly predicament of having to order fire on men that he had once led. The new veterans, fit and skilled and ambitious and desperate for privacy in this vast land, have a restless eye cocked on London and its squatters. In New York, the American Veterans Committee has warned that in a hard winter, and they can be hard indeed, veterans will not look kindly on the locked-up little beach houses and country estates of Long Island, or on the boarded-up mansions of Fifth Avenue. In the university towns these days, many a cloistered professor is embarrassed by the sound of a woman's voice floating quite legally into the midnight air from what was once a man's study, or embarrassed by baby clothes strung across a college lawn. Their embarrassment will be a high-pitched squeak in the roar of defiance that will go up in the cities of America this winter if the GI Bill of Rights is not improved, and if the GI's right to a room of his own is not honored. Harry S. Truman, A Study in Failure. Guardian, 1 November 1948. There is often a heartless contradiction between American ideals and the general willingness to accept them in action. Mr. Truman's biography is the stuff of which all presidents are supposed to be made. It is made of the character and the career party campaign handbooks attribute to their chosen leader. It is on file in every Hollywood studio, heading the category of thoroughly reliable characters whom not even the House Un-American Activities Committee would question. It is described in the schools as the very root and flower of what is best about the American way of life. Yet it appears uneasily in the White House and is remembered as the object of characteristic jokes. President Calvin Coolidge's memory is green in the popular recollection for his cracker-barrel cynicism and his opposition to sin. And now we are ready to recall "To err is Truman," and "Don't shoot the piano player, he's doing his best." Yet the fame of the Truman Investigating Committee was justly earned. It wrote the most searching and sympathetic record of the war administration's blunders and successes. Mr. Truman's history in the Senate was that of an alert debater, a practical humanitarian, a courageous New Dealer from a state festering with political corruption that never tainted his personal history. Many a more pretentious statesman would have quietly forgotten his political machine connections when that machine was exposed and punished in the law courts. But to Harry Truman it was a simple courtesy to leave Washington in his new glory as vice president and go home to Missouri to attend the funeral of the squalid boss Tom Pendergast, who was let out of jail to die at home. Pendergast had picked Truman as his man for the Senate, and Mr. Truman came from the sort of people who despise a man who forgets a favor. Truman had come up the folksy traditional way of the machine politician. A road overseer, farm tax collector, a bridge mender, a drainer of dirt roads after heavy rains, then a postmaster, a club organizer, then tedious nights learning enough law to justify his election as a county court judge. But he knows as well as most that it is also the hard way. At various times he had gone into debt and worked at all sorts of jobs because the convention of going bankrupt was odious to him. He plowed the straightest line of corn in Jackson County, his mother kept on telling reporters. To Harry Truman, the moral implications of that compliment are as binding as the words of a Methodist hymnal. Being present at Pendergast's funeral was an obvious duty. It is, I think, the acting out of such straightforward maxims in a great office that requires tact, timing, and a goodly gloss of two-facedness that has bewildered Mr. Truman and made his administration in the end admittedly inept. When Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox made a pre-war speech in Boston, and, with Roosevelt's private approval, came out for Atlantic convoys for British shipping, the grateful cries of Englishmen were as loud as the screams of protest over here. Questioned at a press conference, Mr. Roosevelt said surely Mr. Knox had a right to speak for himself. Truman would have told all, as he did over the misbegotten plan to woo Stalin with Chief Justice Fred Vinson. When he was a haberdasher, he bought at boom prices and sold at depression prices. His shop failed, but he is not a despondent man, and one can admire the sigh and the plucky grin with which he has, throughout his life, tried to learn from his mistakes. Unfortunately, it is too late to learn when you reach the White House, and Americans who admire the hard luck story in their neighbor will not tolerate it when that neighbor is raised to the elective kingship. The failure of President Truman cannot be called a failure of principle or even a betrayal of the program he inherited. The things he has genuinely wanted to have done have been every bit as New Deal as Roosevelt. In one proposal, the uncompromising Fair Deal for a federal fair employment code, he went headily beyond even Roosevelt's boldness. And of all campaigns, his has made the most sense as merely the politics of survival. While his political rival, Governor Thomas E. Dewey, has promised in his presidential campaign a firm hand on the tiller and a rudder to our ship, Truman has been talking about the need for veterans' housing, about drastic enlargements of the Social Security and health insurance programs, about federal ownership of transmission lines, about the Taft-Hartley Labor Relations Act, about inflation, about longer terms for the Atomic Energy Commission. But there are over 60 million Americans at work. In this time of deceptive prosperity, Mr. Truman's voice sounded somewhat hollow as he went on asking for the things that the country was ready to accept during a depression. The recoil against Roosevelt's New Deal is too easily interpreted abroad as a positive reaction against liberal reform. There is enough evidence in the fight for Senate seats and in the good showing of unrepentant New Dealers, even in states where Dewey will be chosen over Truman, to show that if an impressive man is spouting the New Deal doctrine, he will be heeded. But Mr. Truman is by now worse than unimpressive. He has committed the unwritten, un-American crime of being outsmarted. When he took the oath of office, he was helped along by the legendary assumption that, when all is said and done, homespun men are the shrewdest. His early press conferences gave pause to this comfortable notion. He made impulsive answers that had to be corrected later. The episode of Vice President Henry A. Wallace's dismissal as a candidate to retain his post, demanded by the Secretary of State, was only the first of the rude disillusions. It will not do to say that greatness is lacking. Very few presidents have had any claim on it. But mediocre presidents must depend on careful advice and preserve in public the appearance of authority. Mr. Truman surrounded himself partly with sincere political hacks and made impressive military men substitute for the grand facade he lacked. This latter has been the most interesting and could be the most serious fault in his conception of the President's office. It has puzzled many who would expect so humble a man to be uncomfortable in the presence of so much big brass. It seems to be, however, a true character trait. As a small boy, he was mercilessly ridiculed in school for reading books from choice, and, what is worse, taking piano lessons. He made up for the ridicule by boning up in stealth on military history. He amazed the town by applying for and winning a place at West Point. Then he was turned down on account of bad eyesight. It must have been a shocking blow. He has revealed, throughout his administration, a fearful respect for the judgment of military men. And by the same mechanism of wistful envy, the Truman Doctrine was conceived the day he sat at Fulton, Missouri, in the immense shadow of Churchill. Joe Louis, the champion, retires. Letter number 117, 20 March 1949. Joe Louis has just retired as the world's heavyweight champion. He is an unforgettable man whom we shall very likely never see again, shuffling with great grace up to some wheezing hulk of a man, to bait him with a long left, and then to bring up the shattering, awful thunderbolt of his right, and then to toddle considerately away and wait for the referee to call the roll on yet another ruined reputation. But I doubt I should have thought to write about Joe Louis, or ever been interested in him, if I had not gone down to Baltimore in the spring of 1937. I was staying with a friend, a doctor at the Johns Hopkins Hospital, who had managed a half-day off from his grisly labours with stomach aches and corpses. We'd been out in the scarlet countryside. The short twilight fell. "How about," said my friend, "we go down to Darktown and catch some jazz?" There was a little vaudeville house deep in the coloured section of town where the best coloured bands play. It was the perfect end to a great day. So we packed ourselves in with about 1,000 Negroes, who clapped and stomped in time and sweated like Christians at a Roman circus. It was possibly 90 degrees outside and about 120 inside, but nobody cared. In the middle of the last number, though, something happened outside that rode above the rhythm of the band and the hallelujahs of the audience. From somewhere far off came a high wave of sound. The band played on. It came on nearer, a great sighing and cheering. Suddenly there was a sound of doors splintering and cops barking and women screaming and men going down grabbing their toes and snarling oaths. The band stopped and the lights went up. The black faces all around us bobbed and flashed. Women threw their heads back and howled great cries at the roof. Some people embraced each other, and others cut and swung at each other. This, it turns out, was the night that Joe Louis had won the heavyweight championship. And for one night, in all the lurid dark towns of America, the black man was king. The memory of this night has horrified and exhilarated me ever since. The phrase, "Arise, you have nothing to lose but your chains," must have a terrible appeal to the Negro. Most Southerners know it, and it's why in some places they watch fearfully for every Negro flexing his muscles and wonder if he's connected with the Communists. That immediate fear was not besetting America as it does today, but the lesson was plain. One Negro had outboxed all the living contenders, no matter how white, and James Braddock was white, and he was a racial god. It took several years, and a run of inevitable victories and wide familiarity with Joe in the ring and in the newsreels, for Americans to learn a strange respect for this quiet, beautiful, mannerly youth who never thought of himself as anybody's god, who never played his color up or down, who never questioned a ruling, never flirted with the crowd, kept his mind on his work, stepped scrupulously away when an opponent stumbled, and who, when it was all over, said such embarrassing things over the radio microphones that the commentators would often whisk the mic away from him to the loser, who could be expected to say the proper sentimental clichés. They pushed the mic up to Joe in December 1947, when he'd been fought into a parody of his younger self by Old Joe, Jersey Joe Walcott. A sharp little announcer said, "Did he ever have you worried, Joe, at any time?" This is a question expecting the answer, "Oh, no, I felt fine all the time." Joe said, "I was worried all the way through. Yes, sir, I ain't 23 any more." When you come to look at the life and career of Joe Louis, there is the special dilemma that he is a black man, and that even when you've done your best to judge him as you would other men, there's no way of denying that if he's not the best boxer that has ever lived, he is as near to it as we are ever likely to know. He was born in 1914 on a sharecropper's cotton patch in Alabama, and was as poor as it is possible to be. It was a farm, in theory. It had been rented to them as a cotton and vegetable farm, but the vegetables didn't feed the family. Not by the time Joe, the seventh child, came along. His father broke down, as sharecroppers do, from the daily strain of working from dawn to sunset, and often beyond, and not making enough in crops to feed his children, or to buy them all shoes. They had no money to send him to a hospital, so he went to a state institution and died there. A widower came to help out, and soon married Joe's mother. His 5 children moved in with the 8 of the Lewises. Joe got a little more food and went to a one-room schoolhouse. And then the family moved to Detroit, where the stepfather worked in a motor-car factory. Joe went on to a trade school and worked in the evenings delivering ice from an ice wagon. Then came the Depression, and the family went on relief. This, said Joe, made his mother feel bad. Years later he wrote out a check for the $269 that was the amount of the relief checks they'd had from the government. This, said Joe, made Mrs. Brooks, as she now was, feel better. She seemed to have very definite ideas about debt. When Joe was 18, he came home late one night and found his stepfather blocking the door. "Where have you been, Joe?" he asked. "Over at the gym," said Joe. "Working out." "I thought so," said Mr. Brooks, and lectured Joe about wasting his time with no-goods in gymnasiums. "You go on fooling around with boxing, you're never going to amount to nothing." Joe says this had him really worried. The next day he asked his mother about it. She said it was all right to be a boxer, if that's what you wanted to do. And that was, in a way, the end of Joe's wayward life. The rest was practice and learning. Learning to be beaten to a pulp and coming up again with a new trick or two. Maybe you'll get from all this the idea that Joe Louis is a simple soul with quiet manners, a good boy who never had a crafty thought. Of course he doesn't talk about his respect for his opponents and his decency and casualness with the crowd, because these are fundamental, the characteristics that a man hardly knows about himself, or, if he does, keeps quiet about them. But there is one remark he makes about his pride in money that should round out the picture. "People ask me," he says, "Joe, what will you do when the big money from fighting stops coming in? Won't you have to cut down on your way of living?" I tell 'em I'm going to live good, retired or not retired. I've got investments and I've got ideas. I'll keep on living good. It's them who lived off me who won't be living so good. Well, there he is, the brown bomber no more, a memory of incredible speed, a slow shuffle, a solemn face, a gentleness, a shy acceptance of his greatness. All things considered, a credit to his race, so long as you add the necessary afterthought, the human race, that is. A lighter New Year's Eve, 1951. Letter number 250, 4 January 1952. On a New Year's Eve a year ago, we had a very quiet time in our house. I am sure it was due to a combination of various domestic things, but mainly we didn't feel like going wild or staying up till all hours. The 31st of December 1950 was a very depressing time. We had only 3 friends in, and however much we chuckled and guffawed and beamed a toast at each other, we thought of the hopeless turn in Korea, the sudden and very real prospect, as it then seemed, of a war carried into the vast plains of China. Prime Minister Clement Attlee had come to Washington and gone again, and some of us wondered aloud if it were possible that a year from then we'd still be sitting in our warm house with our children and our friends. One of the closest of our friends, who lives away up the Hudson Valley, confided to us without fuss, but quite seriously, that she had bought some camp beds or cots, and if the thing we all dreaded happened, we could get the family up there and stay with them for the duration. As we were talking, and as the first bells of the new year started to chime, and as a forlorn hooter sounded from some drunk down on the street below, another sound came up to us. It was a siren, over across the park on the west side, a moaning up and down. We all went to the window and threw it open and listened. Sirens had been prohibited months before then, and the police cars and fire trucks had taken to ringing inoffensive and very un-American little bells. Sirens were to be kept for the dreaded thing, an air raid. We laughed off this little siren, but only because nothing happened, and we figured that some jokers on the west side had defied the ban and were announcing the new year in their own grim little way. Then somebody said what a terrific plot it would be if the Russians waited for midnight of New Year's Eve, and just when the hooters and the bells went off, they sent over the first plane. Nobody would believe the sirens anyway. Well, it all seems a very long time ago, more than a year and several nightmares ago. Here we are, and we hear 1952 called again, as we've been calling it for 3 or 4 years, the year of decision, without feeling a slight chill of the flesh and a curdling of the blood. Some of you may laugh, and some of you may even sneer at this panic of a year ago. If we come through another year or 2 or 3, there seems a better than reasonable chance that another generation will live into a peace getting less uneasy every spring. A great many Europeans will then say, "You see, there was nothing to fear after all. You Americans are too jittery to live." This kind of reasoning can never be answered, because no one ever knows for sure why the dreaded thing never happened. Americans were convinced, however, 2 years ago, that unless Europe rearmed with a will and all together, the invitation of an undefended Europe would be too much for the Russians to resist. This, too, cannot be proved. And which Americans, you may ask, felt like that? Such Americans as our panicky friend up the Hudson Valley? Well, yes, though I ought to add she is a very serene and rather serious woman. And 2 of the 3 New Year's Eve visitors who dashed to the window were Englishmen, and they felt the same way. There was, however, one American who felt this way, and I think you will grant that his opinion is at the very least one to respect. He is General Dwight D. Eisenhower. Who shall say, now that we care to think the tide is turning, how much we owe to him, and the example of his leadership and his character? Certainly the very different feelings with which we let in the new year this time are due in some part, in great part, to him. Again, a British Prime Minister is descending on Washington, but the whole mood and timing of the visit is very different from Mr. Attlee's famous and grim little mission. It is the first understatement of the new year to say that Americans are looking forward to Winston Churchill's visit. They are sitting back to enjoy it. They are waiting for the memorable cracks that are bound to come out of the Prime Minister's address to Congress. An old and very die-hard and hard-headed Republican said to me the other night, "You have to hand it to the old man. That line about nobody wanting to keep the British lion as a pet, that line would have been worth 1,000,000 votes to us if we'd thought of it first." The Churchill visit is the big political flutter in Washington, and naturally I am reporting to you for once from Washington. There are other things on American minds, pleasant things that flow, I think, from the change of heart, from the feeling that we are not, just yet, going to have to camp out in the storm cellars. For instance, the travel agencies report that this is the best year for winter vacations since the winter of 1945. Day after day, the papers stream full-page advertisements for Caribbean cruises, holidays in the blinding sun of Arizona, on the beaches of Florida, or skiing in the crunching snows of New England and the Laurentians. A new twist has been given to this fond dream of every American who lives in the northern parts of the country, this wish to ditch the local freeze and local politics and send skittish postcards back from a beach in Florida. A New York resort hotel has fixed itself up so that you can ski and swim at the same time. All right, then, ski and swim the same day. I haven't been up there. It's only 100 miles from New York, but like many another skeptic who's looked at the ads, I've had a yen to try it. They show a couple of happy skiers, all togged up in ski pants and windbreakers, skis on their strapping shoulders, standing on one side of a vast pane of glass. Behind them ripples a hillside deep in snow and speckled with mad little skiers. On the other side of the glass is another couple, in bathing suits and wearing dark glasses. They are dripping still because they've just emerged from a pool. They have towels over their arms and are stepping over the lazy brown thighs of other people lying down in the streaming sun. What sun? The sun coming through the palm trees, naturally. Which palm trees? The palm trees planted inside this great hothouse swimming pool, which is bathed in the ultraviolet light from great sun lamps sunk in the roof. You can see that it's easy to light and heat an indoor swimming pool, even when it is surrounded and protected from the elements with walls of glass. But how about the snow outside? The snows don't come till the new year in this part of New York State. How do they know people will have the snow to ski in? They know it because they provide the snow. When nature fails, they switch on their snowmaking machine and ice over a couple of hills as nonchalantly as you'd ice a couple of cakes, if you had the scarce sugar to make the icing. This little bit of nonsense may be exercising poetic license in its advertisements, but it would be too risky to keep publishing this picture week after week. I think it's probably on the level, because while it is a universal thing to want to have the best of both worlds, it is a typical American thing to arrange it, preferably by electricity. I am able to go off so jauntily on something as light as this because the general mood is far lighter than it has been for several New Years now. I don't want you to think I'm being mystical in attributing this lift of the heart to one man, but I would be simply muffing my job as a reporter if I didn't tell you that the year of decision has lost its original meaning of the year of the Russian decision and has come to mean the year of Ike's decision. Every day the tension tightens. You know that we can't get along without tension. And every week the question booms louder in railway stations, cafeterias, homes, and offices. Is Ike going to run? Part of the maddening but undeniable excitement of American politics, especially in a presidential election year, is that the excitement is deliberately contrived. The curiosity that frets us for a year before the election is quickly demolished by the simple rule in Britain that election campaigns will last no longer than 3 weeks. There is no limit here, and as long as 2 years before the event, prominent men who have idolatrous friends start going around trying to look like a dark horse. The typical trick of American electioneering is the management of timing, of knowing when to announce a candidacy and when to lie low. Europeans often notice that Americans are the slaves of fashion, in amusements, in books, ideas, clothes, foods, admirations, everything. Americans themselves don't say it, but they act on it. The election agents know in their bones that it isn't the virtue of their man that matters most. It is the ability to dangle that virtue just out of the voters' reach long enough to make the voters bay like famished wolves to have him. He may not be very juicy when they get him, but tell an American that this food he can taste, but that he must lay off, and he will organize a caucus or emergency squad to snaffle the forbidden fruit. Dwight David Eisenhower, the boy from the cow town of Abilene, Kansas, the toughest town of the not-so-old West, quite simply looks like the original apple in the Garden of Eden. He will go on looking so as long as he goes about his great business and does not say he means to run. The day after he says he will run, then he becomes something people can take or leave alone, and inevitably many Americans will start to look around for some other prohibited apple. Until the general comes out and says yes or no, it is going to be very hard not to talk about him, even in talks that are supposed to be non-political. We all know about his directness, his tact, his great ability, his modesty, his roguish good looks, and the charm that people newly exposed to it all agree is incredible. But less is known about the boy from Kansas, who was born only 15 years after Wild Bill Hickok stood in the main street of Abilene and tossed a hat into the air and perforated it with a perfect circle of bullets before it hit the ground. Mr. Hickok did this to announce that he had come to Abilene as marshal to bring a little law and order into town. He had already killed 43 men in this praiseworthy cause, and before he was himself shot in the back, he disposed of another 57 in the civic interest. It is surely a gorgeous joke we can all enjoy that the wise and ancient continent of Europe and the newer giant of America should be silencing their scholars and statesmen and nuclear physicists for the moment when Marshal Eisenhower of Abilene, Kansas, shall toss his hat into the ring and riddle it with bullets, by way of announcing that having brought a little law and order into one continent, he means to run for marshal of the other.